Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 11 of Mass Communication 200. This part in the semester is when we move from writing print and digital pieces to broadcast journalism, which is a different style and format of writing. And so we're going to take this week, week 11, to do some practice writing as opposed to completing a new story. So that should give us some time to go over some of the differences in broadcast writing and help you learn some of the unique ways that broadcast allow you to tell stories in an audible and visual way. So, what do I mean by broadcast? Broadcasting refers to radio, podcasts, TV, and some people include digital videos that are produced for the web within broadcasting as a definition. It is different from print media. It is written in a much different way, it follows a different format, and so broadcast writing is very different from what we have done uh, in the first part of the semester. Now, audio news is written for the listener's ears. So you're having to incorporate sounds. The way that you tell a story with your voice impacts the overall message. Because the reader cannot go back and look over your script, you only get one chance to tell the story in broadcasting. And so it's important that in audio news like radio and podcast, you are writing for what people can listen to. In video news, you not only have to write to people's ears, but you also have to write for their eyes because you can see what is happening. And it is important for a visual journalist to think about ways that they can share information in visual and interesting ways through video and graphics. And so broadcasting really is a challenge in the sense that it requires all of the skills that you need for print or digital, but it also requires you to think in a new way by writing for the ears and the eyes. Now, how do you pick broadcast stories? Well, typically you're using the same news judgment and news values as you do in finding a print story. So many of the stories that you've already pitched for your print or online feature could potentially be used as broadcast stories. But you have to find a particular angle. Where print stories allow you to write long format pieces, broadcast stories are typically between 30 seconds and a minute long, meaning you have to really focus in on something specific to cover within a larger universal theme. It is also extremely important that your story idea be something that can be written about in a clear, active, accurate, and effective writing style. So you shouldn't be picking stories where you're having to explain a lot of the elements because that takes up too much time and it can be very confusing to have to learn from a broadcast story. Broadcast stories also really emphasize the way that a lead is written because the lead is what captures the audience's attention. And for broadcast mediums, you're usually competing with things other than your news. So you're competing with the background, what's going on in the car, if you're listening in the radio, or going on in your house, if you're watching television. And so there's lots of distractions. So the leads and your broadcast writing style really have to be emphasized to capture that audience's attention and keep their attention throughout. Now, you also need to consider what are the audio and visual elements of a story. There are many stories that broadcast news have to tell that aren't very visual. And so it really presents a challenge to the broadcasters to have to present this information in a visual or audible way. So, you're really going to want to focus on stories that allow you to write in a shorter, more conversational style, and remember that broadcast stories are structured differently, and we're going to go over those differences here in a minute. But because of that different structure, it also affects the types of stories that you should be choosing. In addition, leads should only focus on one fact And then usually the next sentence is the why. So you share the most important fact in your lead, and then you explain why this happened in the next sentence. Another important distinction between broadcast writing and print writing is that verbs are in present tense. So while we typically write in past tense for print or digital style, we are writing in present tense for broadcasting. Another difference is that attribution begins the sentence as opposed to using the quote and then saying so and so says. This is because listeners can't hear quotation marks. And so it's important to tip off the listener or viewer that this statement is not coming from you, it's coming from your source. So instead of saying, I love this, I love this class, said Danielle Devers, you would say, Danielle Devers said she loves this class. So that is another important distinction in broadcast writing. Now, in terms of writing broadcast leads, they need to be shorter. As we talked about, there should only be one, maybe two important facts listed. So while you might try to get all five W's into a print lead, for broadcast leads, you're really trying to find the most important fact and write to that. You also want to ease the audience into the story. If you share too much information in a broadcast lead, your listener or viewer whose attention you're trying to grab may miss out on that important fact. So you need to capture their attention, but sometimes that means withholding information on purpose. For instance, a lot of stories will say something like, the governor of Alabama declared there's a state of emergency, and then they will go in and use her actual name in the second sentence because there's more detail that can be given within that second sentence. We also want to make sure that our leads are updated regularly and that they emphasize the local content because that is what is important to the viewers. Here are some examples of different types of broadcast leads. And of course, your textbook goes over these in depth. A hard lead is one that gives the most important information immediately. It shares the most important detail first. As we discussed before, though, this can sometimes lose the audience because they are just tuning in, you're just grabbing their attention. And so, if they miss that important fact, it may affect the way that they can listen to and learn from the story later on. So, sometimes you want to share some information before getting into these harder facts. Here's an example from Fox 6 News in a crime story that they shared. Their lead sentence was, bond was set Tuesday at $1 million cash only for a Davenport woman charged with fatally shooting a 29-year-old mother of five, Eloise Chairs, at Chuck E. Cheese in Davenport Sunday night. This is a very poorly written lead. I love Fox 6, but this is not a great broadcast lead because it shares too much information in the first sentence. But you can see that this is a hard lead because they have picked out some of the most important details. They've updated the lead in terms of the new bond that was set. And you can see it shares some of the most important information first. So here's an example from ValoVision News of a hard news lead.
UM is hosting its final flu vaccine clinic of this semester this Wednesday. The clinic will be from 11:30 to 3:30 in Farmer Hall Meeting Room.
So, without continuing in the story, just from the first sentence, you know all the information you need to know pretty much. They say that the final flu vaccine clinic will be held this Wednesday. So, the most important information is shared in that lead. So here is a soft lead. This is another type of broadcast lead. And this tells the audience or listeners that something important is coming up. It helps them tune their attention into the story without missing hard facts. This is also a lead where you're sharing why this is an important story to your viewer, why it matters to them. and how it affects people. So, those are the emphasis ideas, the goals of writing a soft lead. ABC 3340 has written a soft lead for this story where it says polling centers have been busy all day, and right now frustrations over absentee voting are growing. And so, while the story is about absentee voting, they talk about how busy the polling centers have been just to get people's attention, help them kind of say in the audience mind, oh, this is a story about the election and voting. And then you get into the more specific information about absentee voting in the second sentence. Here's an example again from Vision News of a soft lead.
Registration for Registration for spring 2021 starts this week. And if you haven't met with your advisor yet, you need to schedule an appointment as soon as possible. Registration for graduate students open.
So instead of discussing the specific details about registration, this lead says, hey, registration opens this week and you need to meet with your advisor. And then it gives them more specific details like when graduate student registration opens up and things like that. Now, a throwaway lead is a sentence that is used to grab the viewer or listener's attention to help them focus on the story. There's no real information that's given. The story truly begins in the second sentence or paragraph. So, in CBS 42's example, they are trying to promote a story that is about ghost sightings, but their first sentence, the lead, and in fact, even their second sentence is a throwaway. It's something that's meant to grab the audience's attention and make them focus on the story. You've heard the stories, now live the adventure. Do you know anything about what is coming based on those two sentences? Not really. It's not until you get into the third sentence, CBS 42 takes you inside Alabama's most infamous ghost sightings, that you know that this story is going to be about ghost stories. Here's an example again from Vision News.
You can give the gift of life this week. SGA is hosting a blood drive this Thursday from 10.
So you can give the gift of life this week. That doesn't really tell you a whole lot about the story. If the graphic wasn't up, you would never know it was about a blood drive until you get into the second sentence, which contains most of the information. So that's an example of a throwaway lead. Now, the important thing about writing a throwaway lead is that they can be cheesy or cliche when used inappropriately. And of course, Gary Vosot, which is a parody account that makes fun of things broadcasters do poorly, has some great examples.
Tennis, anyone? The answer to that question is usually yes.
So, tennis, anyone? That doesn't really tell us what the story's about. And he continues the throwaway and says, the answer is usually yes.
But in this case, the answer is no. This court is damaged.
And so he is kind of making fun of how broadcasters make these really cliche and meaningless throwaway leads because tennis anyone has nothing to do with a court being damaged by weather. So, umbrella leads, this term is used differently between the two textbooks that we'll talk about. The way that your regular textbook talks about umbrella leads is that it summarizes or ties two things together before going into each of them separately. So you may have noticed during the Hurricane Zeta coverage that they would provide this umbrella lead about how the hurricane was hitting Alabama, but then they would go into the specific coverage and specific city areas that they were covering. But the umbrella of talking about Hurricane Zeta as a total, kind of covers all of these different stories that loosely tie together under severe weather stories. And so it describes the relationships between all of the stories. Fox 6 had an example in a newscast at the end of October, and they said Tuscaloosa police now identifying two suspects. one in a series of car break ins earlier this month. And then they go on to talk about how these car break ins were tied to these cases about hotel break ins and how the suspects were connected. So while they're talking about two different cases or two different crimes, they show the relationship between the stories by connecting them. And so that would be considered an umbrella lead. Please note that when we move into the Jeff Butera chapters, he uses the term umbrella lead a little differently. That's okay. These are just general guidelines, but different shops, different newsrooms will refer to these terms a little differently. Now, the body of a broadcast story is written much differently from print. Instead of the inverted pyramid style, which we have been using for hard news print stories, instead, broadcast stories use the pyramid style. They put the most important facts first. Usually, one fact goes in your lead. Then they give the additional important information and then other not so important information at the bottom. And so it's really structured in a sense where it's either chronological and it follows a pattern, or describing the most important facts in descending order. So the lead should never tell the whole story. While a summary lead in the inverted pyramid style will tell you the five W's and an H, you're really only sharing one fact in a broadcast story. It's the opposite of the inverted pyramid style because think about it, with a broadcast story, you're never going to have to cut a story halfway through. These are already pre written out and pre produced before the broadcast ever airs. So, here is an example of a story that is written in a pyramid style. So,
New hope this morning for a once thriving area that recently has fallen on tough times. A developer unveiling a new strategy for Brookwood Village. CBS 42 News reporter Connie Gatsby live with more on those plans and the role the public can play in deciding on those plans. Connie.
So the anchor lead talks about what the subject is going to be about, but doesn't really give a whole lot of details.
Good morning.
Good morning, Art. A developer has come up with a totally new concept for Brookwood Village, and over the course of the next 2 weeks, they'll be showing off that concept to the public to get the public's input on it.
So now we know that the developer has a plan. We know for the next 2 weeks, the public is going to see it and that they want feedback from other people. So we start off with a very general statement, then we move into some more important facts.
Arlington Properties is that developer. They put together this.
Now we know who the developer is. So you see how this builds into a larger pyramid to understand what is going on within the story. Now, the other structure for broadcast stories are another type is a wine glass structure. And this is typically used for soft news pieces because you put the most important or emotional information first. It's whatever grabs the audience's attention is what your lead is. And so from that emotional start, then you give some important details and then you make sure that you close out with a memorable ending. Usually it's a pretty specific ending too. So here's an example of a wine glass structure.
Food. We all need it to stay alive, but the demand for assistance is rising at an extraordinary rate.
So we don't really know what the story's about yet, but we have an emotional connection because we are hearing that one of our basic needs is not being met for some people in our community.
There's been a huge need since the start of the pandemic, but thankfully, we have the Community Food Bank of Central Alabama. Staff and volunteers working hard every day to make sure nobody goes hungry. Guadalupe with her son Isaac Garcia in just one of the cars, zigzagging the parking lot, waiting to get food.
Right now I'm looking for a job, but it's hard because like with the pandemic, it's so when I saw the food bank ad, so that's why I came.
So you can see we've now moved into important facts from sources, but it's still emotional in nature. Now we're going to move out into the officials to provide a little broader perspective.
Volunteers swiftly filling cars with food at the end of the line, a similar setup at local drives hosted often by the Community Food Bank.
The turnout at most of our events, what we call the mobile pantries, has been overwhelming. The reality is there's a lot more need out there right now than there has ever been.
So now we get the expert source telling us more specific information that's a little bit broader than just one person's perspective.
Have a good day.
In a normal year, the Community Food Bank of Central Alabama feeds around 70,000 people a month. Now it's well over 100,000.
Now we have facts, statistics, details.
We've gone from about 4 distributions a month to 70 distributions a month. And that's a major change, and it's about an 1,800% increase in need.
And so many people need food assistance for the first time since the outbreak. That makes up about 40% of those they serve.
I help feed people in my community that cannot get out. I'll give them food.
In line, Phyllis Strickland reminding us every person has a story.
That's why it's good to share with others, because you never know what shape you're going to be in. So it's a really good thing to share with others.
The community
So then we end the story by going back into this memorable ending. It's emotional, but it's her story. It's very specific. So you can see that's why it narrows down like a wine glass stem does. So that is the wine glass structure of a broadcast story. Now, in order to format your broadcast writing, instead of writing just paragraphs, you're now going to be writing in 2-column formats. We also typically like to double space our scripts, although this isn't something that I require. In addition, most broadcast stations will require that you write in all caps. You need to denote who is speaking. Is it the anchor? Is it the reporter? And within your news station, you're going to decide, do you put the title of the person, like anchor or reporter, or are you using their actual name? It's important to note that the copy editing symbols that we've used to this point would never be used within a broadcast script because those can get confusing and they don't translate to a teleprompter. The typical length of a broadcast story is much shorter than a print or digital story. They're typically between 15 seconds and usually no longer than a minute 30. So 3 lines of copy is about 10 seconds. So you need to know the rate of speech that your person is speaking at. And then from there, you can determine how long the story is. You also need to read your copy out loud because what makes sense in terms of what you're reading may not be very conversational or easy to say. Because the broadcast format relies so heavily on audio, it's important that when you are writing for broadcast that you're actually reading what you're writing. When I will grade your papers or your scripts, I'm going to be reading them out loud to myself, not only to time them, but also to see if they are conversational. You also will put 3 little hashtag symbols or numeric signs at the end of your copy, and that is a signal that the story has ended. Now, some other tips for writing for broadcast, you're going to need to write shorter sentences. You need fewer facts, so don't try to throw everything into one story. You will share fewer facts in broadcasting than you do in a typical print story. Every word you write needs to be tied to a central idea or central point. And it's important that you conserve your words and write concisely. You need to constantly update your information too. So if you're sharing the same story within a 12 o'clock broadcast, it needs to look different at 5 o'clock because you need to provide the audience any update. You need to write for the audience, which means your language choice, your tone, it's going to be more conversational, more informal, and more relaxed than a typical print story is. As I said before, we are writing in present tense. We're going to round numbers up to make them make sense instead of using exact figures. And you need to give numbers some kind of meaning. If I say 10,000 homes are without power, I need to relate that number to something to make it meaningful, such as, there are a total of 10,000 homes, within the city of Bluff Park or the area of Bluff Park in Alabama. Something that puts that number into perspective. You also need to shorten people's titles as much as possible. So instead of giving them the full title of president of the Eastern Division of blah, 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 you would just say president. Just try to find the shortest way to say the title without changing its meaning. You don't put a name first in any instance. So sometimes we would say K. Ivey, comma, governor of Alabama. We don't do that. We would say Governor K. Ivey. And this helps to clarify what the person's title and then names are. We also want to omit middle names or initials. Age and descriptions that are used should go before a person's name, but don't use these unless they are critical aspects of describing that person. So we want to leave out ages, addresses, and other descriptions unless they're critical to the understanding. The attribution always goes before sound bites or sourced information instead of putting at the end. We want to avoid direct quotes unless you're actually hearing the sound clip from your source. And if you do need to use a direct quote, you need to signal to your listener or viewer that, hey, this information is coming from a source. And you would do that through your writing. You also want to avoid too many pronouns because it doesn't, it gets confusing who you are referring to. Make sure you're putting in pronunciation guides for words or names that could be difficult to pronounce. For instance, if I were writing my own name, reporter Danielle Devers tells us more. People often mispronounce my first and last name, so I could put a pronouncer in that says Dan, then Yell, and then Dev and Ers, and that tells my anchor how to read it. Hyphenated words are grouped. So, 15-year-old boy, 2020 election. Even if I'm referring to a year, I'm writing it how I want the speaker to say it. So don't worry about the AP style book rules on hyphenation. Instead, you're trying to hyphenate it how you want it said. We want to spell out numbers 1 through 11, which again is a little different from our original numeral rules for AP style. And we also want to use a combination of numerals and words for very large numbers like 60,000. You would want to use the numeral 60 and the word thousand in order to communicate that because it's easier to read. Don't use abbreviations because we don't speak in abbreviations. So you need to spell out everything. You also need to spell out numbers, signs, and symbols. When you want an announcer to read a letter instead of a word, you place a hyphen between it. So whenever I'm talking about the University of Montevallo as an abbreviation, you would say UM President. Or if I wanted to say AAA, that would be Triple A Insurance. Say it, write it how you would say it. You want to limit the punctuation because they function as breaks in the speech of the speaker. Periods are short stops, commas are longer stops, and ellipses are the longest stop. So keep that in mind as you are using your punctuation. Don't split words on a page either. It all needs to be on the same page and on the same line because it's easier to read. So here is a broadcast script, and here is how you would put this together. I have given you an outline script. Like we said, we're using 2 columns in order to write. The left-hand column is the director cues. It tells the person who is running the show who is speaking and when something needs to roll or play and when it needs to roll, when you need to come out of it and come back to the speaker. So here are the cues that you would use. The first thing we need to do is write a story slug as well as your date and the reporter name that goes up top. And the story slug is just the title of your story. It should be no more than 2 or 3 words. You're going to delete these instructions that I've provided, as well as everything that is in parentheses. Your announcer name or the title goes here. This is the person that's speaking. Continuing on the left-hand side, we have the soundbite roll cue. So when you're taking an interview subject's interview clip, you're going to put the last 3 words that the reporter says. Then you're going to put how long the soundbite runs in seconds. It's called a TRT, or total runtime. Then you're going to put the last 3 words that the interviewee says in the soundbite before we need to return to the reporter, and that's called an out cue. So the roll cue tells the director, here are the last 3 words that the journalist says before I need to play the tape that contains the interview. The soundbite out cue tells the director, here are the last 3 words this clip contains before I need to return back to the journalist. Now, the reporter tag are the last 3 words in the story, and it tells the director that the story has ended. That is also indicated by these 3 hashtag symbols down at the bottom. So over here on the right-hand side, your announcer name or title will go here. I've opted to use titles here because it's just easier to say reporter than to put your individual name in, but you can certainly put your name in there if you're the speaker. You're going to write your lead first, right here, then the body, your soundbite lead in, and we'll be talking about how to write into sound and interviews in future stories, but I'm just showing you how this is scripted and formatted. This is going to be the director cue to roll the soundbite. You're going to leave that as is, but it's bracketed to tell the director that it is a director cue to play the tape. The interview name and interview title goes in parentheses right underneath so that your director, and if you're in broadcast for video, it's also what rolls on teleprompter and closed captioning service. And so that's important to include. You're going to put the word for word verbatim of the interview clip right here. Typically it's done in lowercase, although you can use all caps if you prefer. And then finally, you're going to write a reporter tag at the bottom. Again, we're going to be talking about all of this more in depth, so don't worry if some of these terms are unfamiliar to you. Here is an example of how I would script this radio segment.
Skies are gray and the wind is picking up in South Louisiana as officials urge people to hunker down. Governor John Bel Edwards says evacuations are underway for much of the coast.
So Zeta is literally on our doorstep. The weather is degrading quickly as we speak. So the truth of the matter is those people who are in the path of the storm, you need to be now where you want to be as you ride the storm out.
Widespread power outages are expected. Edwards says the state will prioritize getting power back to polling stations first, and more than 3,000 people are still staying in hotels across the state after 2 other major hurricanes and the pandemic. For NPR News, I'm Tegan Wendland in New Orleans.
So you can hear the reporter speaking the information that is under the lead. Then you hear the soundbite clip from the governor of Louisiana, and you can see the verbatim that I've put in there. And then we return back to the reporter who tags out the story with additional information. You can also see how the left-hand column, the director cues, are filled out so that you get the roll cue, the last 3 words that Tegan Winsland says before the soundbite needs to roll, or of the coast. Once the director hears those 3 words, they know that they are to play the recorded interview. The recorded interview runs for a total runtime of 17 seconds in this case, and the soundbite out cue is the storm out. So as soon as the director hears the words "the storm out" from the governor, he knows to return back to the reporter, who will end the story. The reporter tag is the last 3 words of the story in New Orleans. And we also know that from those 3 hashtags at the bottom. So these script templates, as well as the example, will go into Canvas for you to refer to as you're writing your scripts. But that is how we format broadcast stories. You can also see that the total runtime of the story is 46 seconds. So you can tell a lot of information in a broadcast story very quickly. So now that you understand a little bit more about broadcast writing, then you can go into your discussion post and talk about the differences in broadcast versus print writing. You will have a homework assignment for workbook chapter 13, exercise 4. You'll do numbers 1 through 3. And then finally, I want you to read the chapter that I've uploaded into Canvas from Jeff Butera's book, Write Like You Talk. And I've included the pages all in one document for you to read. If you have not been reading your textbook, first of all, you should be doing that. But if not, you really need to read these Butera chapters. They are very short, very conversational, and there's a lot of great information.